Black Grandma went to the corner store and vanished. 20 years later, a letter explains everything. The last person to see Rose Jenkins alive was Mrs. Patterson from 3B, who watched through her kitchen window as the elderly woman walked down Fulton Street with that familiar slow, careful step of hers. It was 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in September 2005. Mrs. Patterson remembered because she'd been timing her cornbread in the oven. Rose wore her favorite purple cardigan, the one with tiny pearl buttons she'd sewn on herself, and carried the same worn leather purse she'd had for 15 years. "Just going for milk, baby," Rose had called up to 10-year-old Amina, who was doing homework at the kitchen table. "Be right back." Those were the last words anyone in the Jenkins family would hear from Grandma Rose. By 6 p.m., when the streetlights flickered on and Rose still hadn't returned, Amina's mother, Carmen, began making phone calls. First to Rose's church friends, then to the few distant relatives scattered across New York. No one had seen her. No one had heard from her. The corner store owner, Mr. Kim, shook his head when Carmen rushed in, breathless and panicked. "She never came in today," he said, his broken English heavy with concern. "Miss Rose always come Tuesday for milk. Always. But not today." By 8 p.m., Carmen was at the 79th precinct, filling out a missing person report while Amina sat in a plastic chair, swinging her legs and trying not to cry. The desk sergeant, a tired-looking man with gray stubble, barely looked up from his paperwork. "Ma'am, elderly people wander off sometimes," he said, his voice flat with routine indifference. "Memory issues, you know? Or sometimes they just decide they need a change of scenery. Happens more than you'd think." "You don't understand," Carmen insisted, her voice rising. "My mother-in-law doesn't wander. She's sharp as a tack. She raised 6 kids in this neighborhood. She knows every crack in every sidewalk for 10 blocks. The sergeant sighed and handed her a case number written on a yellow sticky note. "We'll keep an eye out, but honestly, most of these cases resolve themselves. People come back when they're ready." But Rose Jenkins wasn't most people. In the small, tight-knit community of Bedford-Stuyvesant, Rose was what folks called neighborhood royalty, not because she had money or status, but because she had something more valuable, a reputation for showing up when people needed her most. At 67, the retired seamstress had soft hands that could mend anything: torn shirts, broken hearts, fractured relationships between neighbors who'd been feuding over parking spots. Her row house at 847 Hancock Street had become an unofficial community center. Young mothers brought their children's clothes to be hemmed for free. Elderly men stopped by for sweet tea and dominoes on her front stoop. Teenagers who'd gotten into trouble at school found themselves sitting at her kitchen table, getting gentle lectures about making better choices while she fed them homemade biscuits. "Rose got the magic touch," people would say. "She can fix anything." But now Rose herself seemed broken, or lost, or worse. The search began informally. Carmen organized neighbors into groups, each taking different sections of the neighborhood. They checked every bodega, every laundromat, every church basement where Rose might have stopped to help with the church supper. They walked the route to Brooklyn Hospital, thinking maybe she'd fallen ill and gotten confused. They even checked the subway stations, though everyone knew Rose rarely left Bedford-Stuyvesant. Mrs. Washington from down the block brought over a casserole. "That woman saved my grandson when he was running with the wrong crowd," she told Carmen, tears in her eyes. "Sat him down every day after school, taught him to sew buttons, kept his hands busy while she talked sense into his head. He's in college now because of Miss Rose." The stories poured out as the search continued. Rose had quietly helped the Gonzalez family avoid eviction by connecting them with a church fund that paid past due rent. She'd taught English to Mrs. Chen's mother-in-law by using fabric patterns as vocabulary lessons. When old Mr. Thompson's wife died, Rose had shown up at his door every Sunday morning for 6 months with a plate of food and stayed to talk about anything except his loneliness. "She was our neighborhood's heartbeat," said Reverend Williams from Mount Olive Baptist, where Rose had been a member for 30 years. "If Rose Jenkins disappeared, then something is very, very wrong." But the police investigation moved like molasses in winter. The detective assigned to the case, a distracted man named Rodriguez, seemed more interested in his coffee than in finding Rose. When Carmen called for updates, he'd sigh into the phone and recite the same script. "No new leads, ma'am. We're doing what we can." They searched her house from top to bottom, looking for clues about her state of mind. Everything was exactly as Rose had left it, her reading glasses on the kitchen table next to a half-finished crossword puzzle, a load of laundry still damp in the washing machine, her Bible open to Psalms with a bookmark marking her place. Her purse sat on the hall table with her keys, her wallet containing $43, and her cell phone showing no unusual calls or messages. Most telling of all was the sewing room. Rose's pride and joy sat undisturbed, dozens of spools of thread organized by color, 3 different sewing machines in perfect working order, and a bulletin board covered with thank you notes from people she'd helped over the years. A half-finished quilt stretched across her largest work table, needles still threaded and stuck into the fabric exactly where she'd left it mid-stitch. She was planning to come back, Amina whispered to her mother as they stood in the doorway of the sewing room. "Look, Mama. She was right in the middle of making something beautiful." As weeks turned to months, the official search wound down. The case file got buried under newer missing person reports. The community gradually stopped organizing search parties, though they never stopped hoping. Flyers with Rose's picture, smiling in her church dress, hands folded peacefully in her lap, faded on telephone poles and store windows until they were just ghostly remnants, edges curled and text bleached by sun and rain. But Amina never stopped believing her grandmother would come home. Every day after school, she'd sit on Rose's front stoop and wait, watching the corner where Fulton Street met Hancock, expecting to see that familiar purple cardigan and careful walk. Carmen would find her there at dinner time, sometimes talking to the empty air as if Rose were sitting beside her. "What are you doing, baby?" Carmen would ask gently. "Talking to Grandma Rose," Amina would say matter-of-factly. "Telling her about my day so she won't miss anything when she comes back." Carmen's heart broke a little more each time, but she never told Amina to stop. In a world where a beloved grandmother could simply vanish between home and the corner store, holding on to hope seemed like the only sane thing to do. Years passed. The case grew cold. The neighborhood began to change as gentrification crept in like morning fog. Young white couples started buying the old brownstones, and longtime residents found themselves priced out of communities their families had called home for generations. But Rose's house remained exactly as she'd left it, a shrine to a mystery that would haunt Bedford-Stuyvesant for 2 decades. And Amina never stopped waiting. 20 years had transformed Bedford-Stuyvesant into something Rose Jenkins wouldn't recognize. The corner bodega where she'd planned to buy milk was now a craft coffee shop called Artisan Brew, complete with exposed brick walls and $20 avocado toast. The old brownstones that once housed 3 generations of the same families had been gutted and converted into million-dollar condos with names like The Heritage and Brooklyn Heights Modern. Amina Jenkins stepped out of her rental car on a crisp October morning in 2025, her breath visible in the autumn air. At 30, she'd grown into the kind of woman Rose would have been proud of, thoughtful, determined, with her grandmother's same careful way of observing the world before acting. Her job as a historical preservationist had taken her across the country, documenting communities before they disappeared entirely, but she'd never expected to return to document the disappearance of her own childhood. The demolition notice on 847 Hancock Street fluttered in the wind like a white flag of surrender. Scheduled for demolition November 15, 2025. Authorized personnel only. Amina pulled the letter from her purse, official permission from the development company to retrieve sentimental items before the wrecking ball arrived. She'd fought for this moment, calling lawyers and city officials, explaining that her grandmother's house contained irreplaceable family history. The key still worked, though it stuck in the lock. 20 years of neglect had warped the door frame, and Amina had to put her shoulder into it before the door gave way with a groan that seemed to echo through the empty street. The smell hit her first, not decay, as she'd expected, but something else. Lavender and lemon oil, the same scents Rose had used to keep the house fresh. Impossible, but unmistakable. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that someone had mysteriously kept clean all these years. The house felt frozen in time. Rose's reading glasses still sat on the kitchen table, now covered with a fine layer of dust but positioned exactly as Amina remembered. The crossword puzzle was still there too, though the newspaper had yellowed to the color of old parchment. 7 across, disappears without explanation. Amina read aloud, her voice cracking slightly. 7 letters. She'd never been good at crosswords like Rose was. Moving through the house felt like walking through her own memories. The living room where she'd spent countless afternoons doing homework while Rose sewed nearby. The kitchen where they'd made Sunday breakfast together, Rose teaching her the secret to perfect biscuits. Love, baby, you got to add love to the dough. The sewing room, still exactly as Rose had left it, with that half-finished quilt stretched across the work table. Amina ran her fingers over the quilt's intricate pattern, a design she didn't recognize from Rose's usual work. This one seemed more complex, with hidden symbols woven into what looked like a traditional double wedding ring pattern. Some of the fabric pieces were familiar, scraps from clothes Rose had mended over the years, but others were foreign, expensive-looking materials that seemed out of place in Rose's modest collection. As she moved toward the stairs, something caught her attention. A thin line of light where there shouldn't be one, coming from beneath the staircase. Amina knelt down, running her hands along the wooden paneling until she found what felt like a seam. The wood was smooth, almost seamless, but when she pressed against it, she felt it give slightly. Her heart pounded as she searched for a way to open what was clearly a hidden panel. Rose had been full of surprises, but this was something else entirely. Finally, she found a small knot in the wood that pressed inward like a button. The panel swung open silently on well-oiled hinges. Inside the narrow space was a metal sewing kit, the kind Rose had always carried when she went to help neighbors with emergency repairs. But this one was different, heavier, more substantial. Amina lifted it out carefully, noting its weight, and carried it to the kitchen table where the light was better. The kit opened with a soft click. Inside, nestled in custom-fitted compartments, were items that made Amina's breath catch in her throat. Fabric swatches in colors and patterns she'd never seen in Rose's collection, each one carefully labeled with dates and initials in Rose's distinctive handwriting. A small brass key, old and ornate, unlike anything that would fit a modern lock. And there, wrapped in tissue paper that crinkled with age, was Rose's butterfly pendant, the one she'd worn every single day for as long as Amina could remember. But it was the letter that made Amina sink into the kitchen chair, her hands trembling as she recognized the careful cursive that had signed countless birthday cards and school permission slips. My dearest Amina, it began, the ink still dark and clear despite the years. If you are reading this, it means you came home, just like I knew you would. It means you have the same heart I tried to nurture in you, one that comes back to where love lived, even when it's time to say goodbye. Amina's vision blurred with tears, but she blinked them away, desperate to keep reading. I need you to know that I didn't leave you, baby. I never left you. Everything I did because sometimes the people we love most are the ones we have to protect by letting them think we're gone. You were too young to understand then, but I pray you're old enough now to forgive me. The letter continued, Rose's voice so clear in the written words that Amina could almost hear her grandmother speaking. But as she read on, the familiar voice began telling a story that changed everything she thought she knew about the woman who had raised her. There are things about your grandmother that I never told anyone, not even your mother. Things that started small but grew into something that had to be kept secret, not because I was ashamed, but because some kinds of love are too dangerous to do in the open. Outside, a demolition truck rumbled past, its engine noise fading into the distance. But inside 847 Hancock Street, Amina sat transfixed as Rose Jenkins began to explain why she had vanished, and why her disappearance had been the greatest act of love she'd ever performed. Amina's hands trembled as she continued reading, Rose's familiar handwriting revealing secrets that had been hidden for 20 years. It started innocently enough. The letter continued. After your grandfather passed in 2003, I found myself with too much time and too much grief. The sewing circles at church helped, but I noticed something troubling. Every week, someone new would show up, women with worry lines deeper than their age should allow, talking quietly about landlords raising rent, about eviction notices, about having nowhere to go with their babies. Amina set the letter down for a moment, remembering those church sewing circles. She'd been only 8 when Grandpa died, but she recalled Rose coming home from those meetings looking more tired than usual, staying up late into the night with her sewing machine humming. Mrs. Rodriguez was the first one I really helped. Rose's letter continued. Remember her? She lived 3 blocks over, had those twin boys who were always getting into mischief. Her husband had been deported, and she was facing eviction with nowhere to take those babies. The church could only do so much, a meal here, a prayer there, but what she needed was a miracle. Amina did remember Mrs. Rodriguez vaguely. She'd brought tamales to the house once, crying while she hugged Rose in the kitchen. At the time, Amina had assumed it was just grief. Everyone cried around Rose, who had a way of making people feel safe enough to let their guard down. I called my friend Dorothy, you remember Miss Dorothy from the post office, and asked if she knew anyone who might need a live-in companion. Dorothy's sister lived alone in Queens, scared to death after her neighbor had been robbed, and lonely besides. It seemed like Providence. Mrs. Rodriguez could cook and clean, the sister could help with childcare, and they could all help each other. The letter detailed more connections Rose had quietly made. Families doubled up in apartments where elderly residents had spare rooms. Young mothers found work cleaning houses for Rose's church friends who needed help but were too proud to ask for it through official channels. Men who lost jobs found work doing handyman repairs for the network of older women who'd become Rose's unofficial partners. Before I knew it, I wasn't just making connections, I was running a whole underground railroad of sorts. Not for slaves this time, but for people being pushed out of their own neighborhoods by greed and indifference. We called ourselves the Stitching Society because we were stitching lives back together, one thread at a time. Amina looked up from the letter, her mind racing. She'd always wondered how Rose seemed to know everyone's business, how she could predict who needed help before they even asked. Now she understood. Rose hadn't been gossiping. She'd been gathering intelligence, mapping the community's needs like a general planning a campaign. The system worked beautifully for 2 years. Rose continued. We helped over 40 families avoid homelessness, found jobs for dozens of people, connected the lonely with the overwhelmed. But then the developers started paying attention. Someone was asking questions about how certain families kept avoiding eviction, how people with no money suddenly had places to stay. The letter's tone grew darker as Rose described increasing pressure. Landlords began demanding to know who was helping their tenants find alternative housing. Some of the church friends who'd been providing jobs or spare rooms received threatening phone calls. One of Rose's key partners, an elderly woman named Miss Althea, found her car vandalized twice in 1 week. The final straw came in August 2005. Rose wrote. A man in an expensive suit showed up at Dorothy's house, claiming to be from the City Housing Authority. He had photographs, pictures of families we'd helped, addresses of our safe houses, even copies of some of the job referrals I'd written. He told Dorothy that what we were doing was interfering with lawful business practices and that there could be legal consequences. Amina felt a chill run down her spine. Rose had been threatened. The woman who'd helped everyone in the neighborhood had been targeted for the crime of caring too much. That night, Dorothy, Miss Althea, and I met in my sewing room, the same room where you used to do your homework, and made a terrible decision. The only way to protect the families we'd helped and the people who'd helped us was to make it look like the Stitching Society had lost its leader. If Rose Jenkins disappeared, maybe the questions would stop. The plan, as Rose detailed it, was both simple and heartbreaking. She would stage her own disappearance, making it look spontaneous and mysterious. Dorothy's cousin lived in a small town upstate called Millbrook, had recently lost her husband, and needed someone to help with her small farm. Rose could disappear there, change her name, and continue coordinating the network from a distance. Miss Althea drove me to Penn Station that Tuesday evening. Rose wrote. I left my purse and keys at home, walked to the corner like I was going to the store, then doubled back through the alley behind the church. By the time anyone realized I wasn't coming home, I was already on a train to my new life. Amina's chest tightened as she imagined 10-year-old herself waiting on that front stoop, watching for a grandmother who was already hundreds of miles away. The hardest part wasn't leaving my home, Rose continued. It was leaving you, baby. Every day for 20 years, I've wondered if I made the right choice. But I need you to understand, if I'd stayed, if I'd kept fighting openly, they would have found ways to punish everyone I'd helped. The families living in our safe houses would have been evicted. The women providing jobs would have been harassed. The whole network would have collapsed. The letter ended with an address in Millbrook, New York, and a final message that made Amina's tears fall freely onto the yellowed paper. I've been writing you letters for 20 years, baby, one for every birthday, every Christmas, every graduation I missed. They're waiting for you upstate, along with the rest of the story. The Stitching Society never really ended. It just moved underground, like roots growing deeper when the surface gets too dangerous. Come find me, Amina. Come find out what your grandmother really became. Amina sat in stunned silence for several minutes, Rose's letter clutched in her hands. The address in Millbrook felt like a lifeline, but also like a possible cruel joke. Could Rose really still be alive? After 20 years of believing her grandmother was gone, the possibility seemed too fragile to trust. She looked around the kitchen, seeing it with new eyes. The sewing room that had seemed like a shrine to interrupted domesticity now revealed itself as what it truly was, a command center for an underground network of community care. Every detail suddenly made sense: the bulletin board covered with thank you notes, the careful organization of supplies, the way Rose had always seemed to know exactly who needed help and when. The brass key from the sewing kit felt warm in Amina's palm. Rose had mentioned it in the letter. Use the key I left you. The trunk in the attic holds the real story. Amina had forgotten there was an attic. As a child, she'd been too small to reach the pull-down ladder, and Rose had always said it was just storage for old Christmas decorations. The ladder creaked ominously as Amina climbed into the dusty space above the second floor. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows across boxes and old furniture. But in the corner, exactly where Rose had described, sat a large cedar trunk with an ornate brass lock that matched the key perfectly. The lock opened with a satisfying click, and Amina lifted the heavy lid. Inside was a treasure trove that made her breath catch. Dozens of composition notebooks filled with Rose's meticulous handwriting. Hand-drawn maps of Brooklyn with houses marked in different colored inks. Folders thick with letters, thank you cards, and photographs of smiling families. Amina opened the first notebook, dated June 2003 to November 2003. The pages detailed the early days of what would become the Stitching Society, written in Rose's careful script. Maria Santos, 34, 3 children ages 2, 5, and 8. Husband injured at construction site, no workers' comp, facing eviction next month. Skills: excellent cook, speaks English and Spanish, good with children. Matched with Mrs. Chin on Eastern Parkway. She needs help with housework and her mother-in-law needs someone who can translate at doctor appointments. Win-win. Page after page revealed the same careful attention to detail. Rose hadn't just been helping people randomly. She'd been running a sophisticated operation that matched needs with resources across the entire community. The colored maps showed safe houses in green, job providers in blue, families needing help in red. Lines connected the dots, showing how Rose had woven together a web of mutual support that spanned all of Bedford-Stuyvesant. One folder contained dozens of letters, all addressed to the Angel of Hancock Street. Amina recognized some of the names, families she'd known as a child, though she'd never understood their circumstances. Dear Miss Rose, I can never repay you for what you did for my family. When Marcus got sick and I lost my job, you didn't just find us a place to stay, you found us hope. The Johnsons treated us like family, and now Marcus is healthy and I'm working again. You saved our lives. Another letter made Amina's eyes fill with tears. My grandmother always said angels don't have wings, they have sewing machines. Thank you for teaching my daughter that there are still good people in the world. The scholarship money you helped us find means she'll be the first in our family to go to college." The notebooks spanning 2004 and 2005 showed how the network had grown increasingly sophisticated. Rose had developed a coding system for different types of assistance. She'd created intake forms for new families and evaluation sheets for potential helpers. Most remarkably, she'd established a primitive but effective communication system using church bulletins, community center flyers, and even coded messages in the classified ads of the local newspaper. "Seek seamstress for alterations, flexible hours, good pay," was code for "safe housing available." "Grandmother needs companion for reading and light housework," meant elderly person willing to help young family. The ingenuity of it all astounded Amina. But the final notebook, dated August 2005, revealed the darkness that had driven Rose away. Photographs of the same families Rose had helped, clearly taken with telephoto lenses. Copies of eviction notices that had been mysteriously withdrawn. A business card for someone called Reynolds Development Solutions, with a handwritten note. "They know." Dorothy followed. "Be ready." The evidence was overwhelming. Rose hadn't been paranoid, she'd been hunted. Amina found the address Rose had mentioned in her letter and drove to a small house in nearby Crown Heights. The woman who answered the door was ancient, probably in her 80s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that immediately recognized something familiar in Amina's face. "You're Rose's grandbaby," she said before Amina could introduce herself. "Lord have mercy, you look just like her at your age. Come in, child. I've been waiting 20 years to tell someone this story." Mrs. Evelyn Washington, no relation to the Mrs. Washington from Hancock Street, invited Amina into a living room filled with photographs of children and grandchildren. Her hands shook slightly as she poured tea, but her voice was strong and clear. "Your grandmother saved my life," she began. "Not just my life, my children's lives, my grandchildren's lives. When my husband died in 2004, I thought I'd lose the house. Couldn't make the payments on my own. Rose found me a renter, a young teacher who needed a quiet place to live and study. That rent money kept me from losing everything." Mrs. Washington confirmed every detail of Rose's story. The network had been real, vast, and effective. But she also provided new information that Rose's letter hadn't included. "She never stopped, you know," Mrs. Washington said, her eyes twinkling. "Even after she left Brooklyn, your grandmother kept coordinating help for people. She'd call me every few months, asking if I knew anyone who needed assistance. She'd send money sometimes, or connect people with resources upstate. The Stitching Society never really ended, it just got quieter." She pulled out a shoebox filled with Christmas cards, all signed, "Your friend in the mountains." The postmarks showed Millbrook, New York, spanning nearly 2 decades. "Last card I got was about a year ago," Mrs. Washington said softly. She mentioned she was getting tired, but that she had one more project to finish. Something about making sure her granddaughter would understand her choices. She paused, studying Amina's face. "I think you were that project, honey." As Amina drove back to Rose's house, her mind raced with questions and possibilities. Rose might be gone, but she'd left behind something extraordinary, a legacy of quiet resistance, community care, and sacrificial love that had touched hundreds of lives. The demolition was still scheduled for tomorrow, but Amina no longer felt like she was losing Rose's house. She felt like she was finally understanding what Rose had really built there. Back at the house, Amina climbed to the attic one more time, driven by something Mrs. Washington had said. She mentioned she had one more project to finish. The cedar trunk still sat open, its contents scattered around Amina like pieces of a puzzle she was finally learning to assemble. But now she looked more carefully, searching for something she might have missed. In the very bottom of the trunk, beneath the final notebook, her fingers found an envelope that was different from the others. Heavier paper, sealed with red wax that bore the impression of a butterfly, the same butterfly from Rose's pendant. The envelope was addressed simply, "For Amina, when she's ready to carry the thread forward." Inside was another letter in Rose's handwriting, but the paper was newer, the ink fresher. The date at the top made Amina's heart skip. September 15, 2024. Less than 2 months ago. Rose had been alive less than 2 months ago. My dearest granddaughter, the letter began. If you're reading this, it means I've passed on, and it means you found your way home just like I prayed you would. I'm writing this from my little house in Millbrook, looking out at the apple trees I planted when I first arrived here 20 years ago. They're heavy with fruit now, ready for harvest. I suppose I am too. Amina's vision blurred, but she forced herself to keep reading. The doctors tell me I have maybe 6 months, maybe less. My heart is finally wearing out, they say, but I think that's wrong. My heart isn't wearing out, it's full. Full of 20 years of love I couldn't give you in person, full of gratitude for all the lives we've touched through the Stitching Society, full of hope for what you might choose to do with everything I'm leaving behind. The letter went on to describe Rose's life in Millbrook. She'd taken the name Ruth Miller and had lived quietly on a small farm with Dorothy's cousin, Helen, until Helen passed in 2015. After that, Rose had lived alone but never in isolation. The Stitching Society had evolved, using technology Rose barely understood but had learned to navigate with help from younger members of the network. We use something called email now, and text messages. Rose wrote with what Amina could imagine was her characteristic wry smile. Helen's daughter taught me. It's made coordinating help so much easier than our old system of coded newspaper ads. We help people all over upstate New York now, families facing eviction, women leaving dangerous situations, elderly people who need companionship. But the most surprising revelation came in the letter's middle section. Rose hadn't just been coordinating a support network from exile, she'd been working. For 20 years, she'd continued taking in sewing commissions, working through a referral system that spanned from Brooklyn to Albany. Wealthy clients who wanted custom alterations or repairs found their way to Ruth Miller through a word-of-mouth network that never questioned why she preferred to work through intermediaries. I charged those rich ladies 10 times what I used to charge in Brooklyn, Rose wrote, and Amina could practically hear her grandmother's mischievous chuckle. Funny how people value your work more when they think it's exclusive. Every overpriced hem on a designer dress helped pay for groceries for a family in need, rent assistance for someone facing eviction, or school supplies for children whose parents were working 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. The financial details that followed took Amina's breath away. Over 20 years, Rose had accumulated nearly $300,000 through her careful combination of high-end sewing work, modest living, and smart saving. But more than that, she'd established a legal trust fund, working with a lawyer in Albany who believed her story and admired her work. The trust is called the Small Miracles Fund, Rose explained. I chose that name because I learned long ago that most people don't need big dramatic rescues. They need small miracles. A month's rent when someone gets sick and can't work. Groceries when food stamps run out before the month does. A security deposit for a family trying to escape an unsafe neighborhood. School supplies for a child whose parents are choosing between books and medicine. The trust had specific guidelines, all written in Rose's careful handwriting and legally documented. No publicity ever. No bureaucratic applications or means testing. Recipients would be identified through a network of community members, pastors, teachers, social workers, and neighbors who knew who needed help. The assistance would be delivered quietly, often through anonymous gifts that would allow recipients to maintain their dignity. But here's the thing, baby, Rose continued. The trust needs someone to run it. Someone who understands that real community care isn't about charity, it's about justice. It's about understanding that when your neighbors thrive, you thrive. It's about knowing that sometimes love looks like giving people exactly what they need, exactly when they need it, with no questions asked and no strings attached. Amina's hands trembled as she read the final paragraph. I'm leaving this choice to you, Amina. You can take the money and walk away. Lord knows you've earned the right to live your own life without carrying your grandmother's burdens. Or you can take up the thread where I'm leaving off. Not in the same way. The world has changed, and the work needs to change with it. But the need is still there. In Brooklyn, In every neighborhood being transformed by greed. People still need small miracles, baby. They still need someone who believes they deserve better than just surviving. Attached to the letter was a business card for the lawyer who'd helped Rose establish the trust, along with a thick envelope containing legal documents that would make Amina the fund's administrator if she chose to accept the responsibility. But the final item in the envelope was what broke Amina's heart completely. 20 birthday cards, one for each year Rose had missed, each one signed, "Love, Grandma Rose," and containing a pressed flower from her garden in Millbrook. 20 Christmas cards with the same careful handwriting wishing her granddaughter joy and peace. Cards for high school graduation, college graduation, her first job, achievements large and small that Rose had somehow kept track of from hundreds of miles away. The last card was different, a simple note card with a butterfly on the front. Inside, Rose had written, "Happy 30th birthday, my beautiful granddaughter. You came home, just like I knew you would. The house may be coming down, but hearts still need stitching. All my love, always and forever, Grandma Rose." Outside, the demolition crew was setting up for tomorrow's work. But inside 847 Hancock Street, Amina Jenkins sat surrounded by the pieces of her grandmother's secret life and realized that Rose's greatest gift wasn't the house, or even the money. It was the choice to carry love forward, one small miracle at a time. 1 year later. The autumn air carried the familiar sounds of Bedford-Stuyvesant, children walking home from school, the distant hum of traffic on Fulton Street, the rhythmic clacking of subway trains. But now there was something new in the mix, the gentle whir of sewing machines floating through the open windows of 847 Hancock Street. Where Rose's old row house had once stood, a new building rose from the same foundation. Not a luxury condo or artisanal coffee shop, but something the neighborhood had never seen before, a 2-story community center with large windows that let in streams of golden afternoon light. The sign above the door, crafted from reclaimed wood and painted in Rose's favorite purple, read simply, "Rose House Community Sewing Studio and Resource Center." Inside, the space hummed with quiet activity. A dozen sewing machines sat at stations around the main room, each one occupied by someone learning or teaching or simply creating. At one station, Mrs. Patterson, now 85 but still sharp-eyed, guided a young mother through hemming her daughter's school uniforms. Near the window, 2 teenagers worked together on a quilt, their conversation a mix of gossip and geometry as they calculated angles for their pattern pieces. Amina sat at what had been Rose's old sewing station, carefully stitching a torn backpack for Marcus, a 7-year-old whose mother worked 2 jobs and didn't have time for repairs. The backpack was dinosaur-themed, and Marcus waited patiently in a chair beside her, swinging his legs and explaining the differences between herbivores and carnivores with the passionate intensity only children could muster. "My teacher says T-Rex wasn't really the biggest predator," Marcus informed her seriously. "There was one called Spinosaurus that was even bigger. Is that right?" Amina replied, threading a new needle. "Well, this little tear in your backpack doesn't stand a chance against either of us." The backpack repair was simple work, but it represented something larger. Marcus's mother Keisha was a regular at Rose House, not as a client, but as a participant. She taught basic financial literacy workshops on Tuesday evenings in exchange for after-school care for Marcus. It was exactly the kind of mutual aid Rose had envisioned, but adapted for a new generation. The Small Miracles Fund operated from a discreet office on the 2nd floor, staffed by 3 part-time coordinators who worked with a network of community members to identify needs and provide assistance. In its first year, the fund had prevented 14 evictions, provided school supplies for over 60 children, covered emergency medical expenses for 8 families, and helped 12 people start small businesses with microloans. But perhaps more importantly, Rose House had become something Rose herself might not have anticipated, a place where the work of community care happened in the open. No more coded messages or secret networks. The sewing studio provided a natural gathering place where neighbors could share information, resources, and support without having to ask for charity. "Mrs. Chen's grandson is looking for work," someone might mention while cutting fabric. "He's good with computers. My sister's looking for someone to help with her website." Another voice would respond. Have him call her. Connections happened organically, the way Rose had always believed they should. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant lower when Amina heard familiar footsteps on the front stairs. Mrs. Washington from Crown Heights came every Friday, bringing updates from the network of Rose's old friends and sometimes new people who needed help. Today she was accompanied by a young woman Amina didn't recognize, someone who looked nervous but determined. Amina, honey, Mrs. Washington called out. I want you to meet Destiny. She's got a situation that might be right up our alley. Destiny was 19, recently aged out of foster care, working full-time at a fast food restaurant but still struggling to afford rent on even the smallest apartment. She'd heard about Rose House through a coworker and wasn't sure what kind of help they provided, but she was willing to try anything. Amina set down her sewing and invited Destiny to sit at one of the consultation tables near the back of the room, spaces designed to feel casual but private. As she listened to Destiny's story, Amina found herself thinking about Rose's letter. Most people don't need big dramatic rescues. They need small miracles. A security deposit for a shared apartment. First month's rent. Bus money for a better job interview across town. These weren't dramatic gestures, but they could change the trajectory of a young woman's entire life. Let me see what we can do, Amina told Destiny, pulling out the intake forms that looked nothing like paperwork and everything like a conversation between neighbors. As the day wound down and the sewing machines fell silent, Amina walked through Rose House, turning off lights and straightening chairs. The walls were lined with framed photographs, not of donors or board members, but of the people who'd been helped and the volunteers who'd done the helping. Smiling families at graduation ceremonies, elderly people surrounded by friends at birthday parties, children showing off perfect attendance awards. In the center of the main wall hung Rose's butterfly pendant in a simple shadow box, alongside a plaque that read, She vanished not to escape, but to give others a place to land. Below the pendant was Rose's final letter to Amina, framed and protected behind glass. The last paragraph was visible to anyone who stopped to read it. The house may be coming down, but hearts still need stitching. All my love, always and forever, Grandma Rose. As Amina locked the front door and headed home to her own apartment a few blocks away, she could hear the sound of children playing in the small garden behind Rose House, a space where community members grew vegetables they shared with anyone who needed fresh food. The laughter mixed with the evening sounds of the neighborhood, creating a symphony that Rose would have recognized and loved. The neighborhood was still changing. Gentrification hadn't stopped, and the need for places like Rose House was greater than ever. But now there was something Rose had never had during her time in exile, a community of people working openly together, no longer afraid to show their care for one another. Rose Jenkins had vanished 20 years ago to protect the people she loved. Now her legacy lived in the open, stitching together a neighborhood one small miracle at a time, proving that love doesn't disappear, it just changes thread. The work continued. The circle held. And somewhere in the autumn air, Amina could swear she heard the sound of Rose's approving laughter carried on the wind like a whispered blessing. That's my girl.